Okay. Well, Jay, hopefully we can talk a little baseball later on.
Let's hope.
So
Do you
that
have
was
a
so much
microphone,
fun
Jay?
the other night.
What's that?
Do you have a microphone?
I do not.
He will hear. Yeah. Okay. Folks, thank you all for coming to our program this afternoon. This is going to be a little different. It isn't anything that we've explored in the past here at the Missouri Cherry Blossom Festival. It's going to be somewhat different, and Ulysses is chuckling, but we have composed with us the most wonderful panel of presidential descendants they're descended from American presidents who have something all in common. You know, it's interesting when we focus on genealogy, and that's a topic that a lot of people are very interested in. It isn't something that we've delved into here at the festival. So that's going to be the topic today. We're going to be looking at a couple of different ancestral histories of different presidents, but Jenny Harville, the great-granddaughter of Calvin Coolidge, Jay Garfield, the great-great-grandson of James Garfield, and Ulysses Grant Dietz, the great-great-grandson of President Ulysses Grant, all have an hereditary commonality. They are all descended from Puritan New England. And so they have multiple ancestors who all came to the American colonies during a 10-year period, 5 years either side of 1635. And the presidents who are descended from these Puritan New Englanders share a background that is starkly different from some of the other presidents, many of whom are descended, for instance, from the Celts. And Ulysses does have a Celtic strain, and so we're going to talk with him a little bit about that later on. And how is it that somebody who's has such a strong Puritan New England ancestry could also be Celtic too? You know, those Celtics were pretty strong warriors, and we know that, Mary Aker, when it came time for the American Civil War. And we think about so many people in the South, the vast majority having been descended from the people of Ulster, Scotland, and the northern counties of England. A history that was very different from the people who came from the southeast section of England known as East Anglia, who were the Puritans. So we're going to be focusing on all this today. Just a little bit of background, something that's been interesting for me over the years, and I've had a chance to share quite a bit with Jenny. We've corresponded pertaining to this and a little bit with Ulysses. I'm very fortunate in that all three of these folks and I share common ancestors who came from Puritan backgrounds. And somebody might say, well, isn't that kind of an exaggeration, hyperbole, that you could be related to all these American presidents' children? And actually, no. And let me explain to you why. When the Great Puritan Migration occurred, and this coincided with the years in which King Charles I suspended British Parliament. So this was at the time of their removal to the American colonies when the Puritans were suffering the most. They were greatly castigated, greatly ridiculed by the King of England, and very strong restrictions were placed on them. So this surge of the Puritan migration began in 1630, and it continued for 10 years, going up to 1640. As a matter of fact, all of Jenny Harville's 17th century ancestors had backgrounds going back to the counties in East Anglia, the southeast section of England, counties like Middlesex, Suffolk, Sussex, Essex, Lincolnshire, all of those counties. So it was very different from people like Andrew Jackson, Jimmy Carter, Lyndon Johnson, Bill Clinton. They couldn't have come from more diametrically different backgrounds than did Jenny Harville, Jay Garfield, and Ulysses Grant Dietz. There were only 21,000 people from Puritan New England who came, Jamie, and stayed in the American colonies. The vast majority relocating in the New England colonies, specifically in Massachusetts and Connecticut, later branching out into New Hampshire and to Rhode Island and Vermont when Vermont became a state. Okay? Their culture was the total antithesis of what the Celts was. And we're going to talk about some of the different facets, some of the things that characterize the typical Puritan New Englanders who came. But only 21,000 of them. That's why it's not at all unusual. If any of you have Puritan New England ancestries, it's a guarantee that you're going to share a common ancestry with so many of the different American presidents. People like Franklin Pierce, Millard Fillmore, Ulysses Grant, Grover Cleveland, Jay Garfield, Jenny Harville, Richard Nixon, the Bushes. All of these folks would be descended from the Puritan New Englanders. As a matter of fact, the Bushes are descended from one of the most prominent of New England families, ministerial families, the Buckleys out of Concord, Massachusetts. And I know, Bill, you're very familiar with the Buckley ministers, having done so much of your research in Concord, Massachusetts over the year. This is one of the finest historians I've ever had the good pleasure of knowing, Bill Anderson, as well as this lovely person who is sitting in the second row here, Mary Aker. And if any of you have ever heard Mary, when she interviews different presidential descendants, it's a real treat. So I hope that you've had the good fortune to meet her in the past and that you have the opportunity to meet her now and in the future. But anyway, so yeah, there was a hierarchy that developed in Puritan New England, and it was composed of ministerial families like the Cottons, the Mathers, the Buckley family. And they had all been ministers in Puritan East Anglia, in those aforementioned East Anglia counties, and they came and relocated, and they formed this, I guess, what we could call, Ulysses, kind of an ecclesiastical hegemony, okay, if that makes sense. And so they were the shakers and the movers in Puritan New England. Now, the Puritans, their concept of liberty was very different from what our concept of liberty is. For the Puritans, I hope she's in deep thought thinking about what we're talking about here. Anyway, their concept of liberty was very different from what our concept of liberty is. Their concept of liberty was to practice their puritanical religion the way that they wanted to. And that didn't provide for any accommodations for people who were outside of that Puritan scope. In other words, some of you have probably heard about the treatment that the Quakers received in some of these New England towns. And for instance, a couple of them were even killed by Puritans. Others were maimed. So the Puritans didn't tolerate people outside of their own particular religion. You know, it's interesting, folks, because when we look at, for instance, the Celtic ideal of liberty, that's another one that's starkly different. The people such as the Bill Clintons and the Lyndon Johnsons and the Andrew Jacksons, who died with more lead in his body than was probably humanly possible for most people. You know, they came from either the counties in the north of England or from Scotland or from Ulster, which today would be Northern Ireland. The Celt, and they were of Celtic ancestry. The Celts, who ended up coming to Appalachia and then settling throughout the American colonies, but mostly, though, most of them gravitated to the southern states. Okay? Many of you who reside here in Missouri today are descended from the ancient Celts. That's your background. And I would imagine that by far and away, there are more people in the audience today who are descended from the Celts as opposed to having Puritan New England ancestors. The Celts believed that their concept of liberty should be for the right for them to do as they pleased. And they weren't going to follow what anybody else dictated. Now, I want you to think about something. Think about, because this plays into American history. And I think it's so important for us, folks, to be able to grasp it this way, that who we are today in the United States is who we were. When the Celts came and settled originally in Appalachia, all the way beginning in Pennsylvania and going all the way down to Georgia eventually, and then spreading out across the American South. As I mentioned, those people who came were very, very similar to their Celtic forebears. They believed, as I mentioned, that for them, their idea of liberty meant for them to be able to do what they wanted to do. And nobody was going to stop them. Now, I want you to think who the Celts' main nemesis would have been in Britain long before they ever came to the American colonies. Jamie, who would they have been? The Celts' main nemesis. Oh, guys, think of, they were in war against them, Mary, for hundreds of years. No. Mary, within Britain, who would they have been? The English. Yes, remember, they were always in conflict with the English. Any of you ever watched the movie with Sir William Wallace? Okay, Braveheart. That's a pretty good depiction of the hatred that existed between the Scots, the Celts, and the English, who were trying to control that part of the British Isles. Okay, and that's what we're going to talk about here, because he does have a strain of Celt in him. I know, we're going to get, but I'm just playing up to this. Okay, so they were always at war. They were a warring people who were always fighting the English. Now, think about it. Let's fast forward to the 1800s. Let's move up to the Civil War. You have most of the people living in the South who are Celts. And I hate it when they portray the Civil War as brother against brother. The American Revolution was much more brother versus brother than the Civil War was. The Civil War was culture versus culture, region versus region. Now, the Celts in England, in the British Isles, hated the English. Okay? What did the Celts, do you think, what do you think they thought about? Whom did they see as the enemy in the United States? Think about where the center of our government is. Washington. They believed nobody is going to tell us how to live our lives. As one historian said not long ago, the Southern people, the Celtics' ancestry, entire history, had prepared them for the American Civil War. And if you ever wonder why the Civil War lasted 4 years, these tenacious Celtic descendants were the reason why. All right, so we're going to focus a little bit on the different ancestries here. And I'd like to start with Jenny Harville, because Jenny's ancestry, folks, is entirely of Puritan ancestry. Now, just a couple of things that would characterize it. And just for blanks and giggles last night, I put something together and focused on Jenny's 17th century, that would be her 1600s ancestors, for all of whom for which data is supplied. And there were 50 females for which I found information. For the males, I found 51. Now, naming patterns were one way that it was very, very different from, say, the Celts. Okay? For the Puritan New Englanders, they would pick almost entirely biblical forenames. And so in this case, for Jenny's case, are we okay? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Is that working okay, guys?
Yeah. And
okay.
He'll adjust volume, but you're on the
Great. Okay. So anyway, the Puritans would pick out biblical forenames to name their kids. And some of the most common ones, and we'll go over this in just a minute, because this gal here, it typifies the Puritan experience. And the forenames in her ancestry are typical of that. Out of the 50 women, 10 of them were named Elizabeth. So for 24 out of the 50, nearly half, Bill Anderson, were named either Elizabeth, Hannah, or Mary. Just half. Now sometimes the Puritans didn't want to pick, for instance, the most revered biblical names, especially with the men, because they felt that that was too audacious, and maybe too ostentatious. And so they refrained from naming their male children names like Moses, for instance, or David. You had some Davids who popped up, but not very commonly. So for instance, in Jenny's ancestry, 11 of her 51 17th century ancestors were named John. As far as John, Jonathan, and James, that constituted about 40% of all of Jenny's known male Puritan ancestors. So a lot of repetition in the names. And James, I found the same thing in Jay, I found the same thing in your ancestry too. I want to start out here with Jenny. And Jenny, let's talk about some of the identifying features of the Puritan experience. Things that characterized Puritan New Englanders, how those traditions were passed down to your great-granddad, Calvin Coolidge, and maybe today, how they've played in to your own life.
Well, first of all, we'll talk about the names. John is hugely present in my family. My brother's name is John. My grandfather's name was John, who was Calvin Coolidge's son, older son. And then Calvin Coolidge's given name was John. So
He was John Calvin.
he was
Coolidge.
John Calvin Coolidge. Yep. So it's definitely in there a lot. Now, in terms of religion or religiosity, we had a lot of Methodist, Baptist, and what we like to call Congo, United Church of Christ. So there was a little town church that was in Plymouth. It's still there in Plymouth. And so that's where most of the children would be taught their Bible studies. Was actually through Calvin's grandmother, who was a Sarah. And Calvin was taught not to, and this is probably typical of a lot of religions, cannot dance in church. No dancing in church. So there was a lot of biblical readings, and that kind of thing. What else would you like to do?
Well, I thought that was interesting that you just mentioned the biblical readings, because there was one book in Puritan New England, folks, which virtually every family had, and that was the Bible. And that was how the children learned to read. It became a very literate society, much different from the Celts in the American South, who did not put a premium on reading. And as a matter of fact, a great number of them had an aversion to reading. And, Celts or people of Celtic ancestry would say, sometimes, Jenny, the only time I've ever been cheated is by somebody who had book learning. And so the Puritans, and you think about that today, think about which part of the country, folks, has such strong educational values. And you look at the test scores around the country, Ulysses invariably, the highest scores are in the Northeast. And so kind of interesting. When you were talking too about the names, I think it's interesting because 3 of Jenny's Puritan ancestors' forenames were Comfort. Their name was Comfort Star, 1, 2, and 3. Sometimes what the Puritans would do, they'd simply close their eyes, and whichever name or word in the Bible their fingers landed on, that became the name of that child. So Jenny had 3 people named Comfort Star.
See? So, that's great. That's really interesting. Comfort Star. President Calvin thought there was a possibility that there might be some Indian blood in his background. And he was very, very interested in Indian heritage. And there were some pictures of his grandparents that had like really angled jaws and looked like they could be of Indian descent. That was never proven. I took a DNA test because I was just curious about my background, and I have no Indian blood. So, at least
Right out of it.
that I'm aware of. I tell people, oh, I'm as waspy as they come. But, and other things that, so Calvin Coolidge would also read, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn. He would learn about the Green Mountain Boys. His grandmother would read that to him. He would, he dabbled in blacksmith. So there was a blacksmith in Plymouth who he would watch and learn from and watch. Unfortunately, he didn't get very great at, wasn't great at it, he wasn't quick at it, but it was a way of him learning just to see how things went. And so that's what he would do. Maple sugaring was a big thing too in Plymouth, Vermont. He could sap trees better than any other boy in that town. And he was, his parents were proud to say it. Lots of farming, as you can imagine. Tending to the cows, tending to just the farm animals in Plymouth. Trying to think of what else.
Jenny, I'm curious, how old were Grace and Calvin when they married?
Oh.
And I'll explain why I'm interested. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so they were married in 1905. You're gonna make me do the math. And Grace was, born in let's start with Calvin. He was born in 1872.
Okay.
And then Grace was born in
he was 33.
1879.
So he was 33.
33, and then, so.
And so she was 26. Okay. That's interesting to me too, folks, because here's something that defined people from Puritan backgrounds. They married at a much later age than did, for instance, the Celts.
Older.
Yeah. And for instance, for Jenny's ancestors, and I was doing this last night, counting this up, and this coincides exactly with what the statistics tell us for Puritan New England. Most of Jenny's 17th century ancestors married the men when they were 26. The women were 23. So conversely to the way you might see it pictured in Hollywood, they weren't these young kids who were getting married. The men were established, the women were in their early 20s. That's when they married. Conversely, when you look at the Celts, thinking about in Appalachia, the American South, the average age at marriage for men was 20. The average age for women was 19. So just another example of how different, very different these backgrounds were.
And we have kept that up in our family, because I think my parents were 27 and 30 when they were married, and my husband and I, maybe I'm thinking of my husband and I, 27 and 30, and we had our first child at 31, when I was 31.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
we were older, we were out of graduate school.
Here was another defining difference. The premarital pregnancy rates, folks, in Puritan New England, do you think they would have been high or low? Very low. About 7 to 10%. So the vast majority were waiting until marriage, until they would have premarital sex. And I have to say this, for even the Quakers were even lower than that. It was about 4%. So the Quakers were abstaining from sex before marriage too. Yeah. So just very, very different from other peoples in the United States. Jay Garfield, how old were you when you got married?
I was 20. How old was I? I was 27.
Okay. Yeah, so you were right in line with the, yeah. Now, Jay, I found this interesting because the other day when we were visiting, you identified as, you said, I'm very much, as Jenny just said, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, waspy. And so if you could just tell us a little bit about your background and maybe some of the elements coming from Puritan New England that have been passed on to President Garfield and then have come down to you, albeit 4 generations later.
Sure. Well, we talked about this at length. So President Garfield actually was a preacher. He was a member of the Disciples of Christ. And Lucretia was also a member of Disciples of Christ before they were married. Lucretia's father, Zebulon Rudolph, is actually one of the primary founders of the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, which is now Hiram College. So one of the things that James did to get through college was he preached. But also he was a janitor at Hiram, well, the Western Reserve Eclectic. So that was a big part of his education and Lucretia's education. They were in the church, the Disciples of Christ, and so that was a big part of, basically they went to, private school.
Right. Well, and that's something that was obviously passed down because folks in Puritan New England, it's so interesting, that was like what we would call a civil religion or Bill, like a theocracy. So yeah, that was intertwined with civil duty, was religion. They were one and the same. Once again, very different from other cultures in the American colonies.
Right. Well, and then Ohio, and my area of Ohio, you can't, for Garfield, for him and Lucretia, you actually can go from cradle to grave and cover their life span. So
yes,
James was actually born in what is now Pepper Pike, but it was Orange, Ohio, just outside Solon, which I live now in Solon. James' mother is buried in Solon, in a cemetery in Solon. James and Lucretia are buried in Cleveland. They're buried in Lakeview Cemetery. But they didn't go far from that area. The Disciples of Christ are there. There's many Disciples of Christ churches around, and James preached at all of those churches as well.
You remember who was a disciple of Christ?
So it was a big part of his
James Jones.
His thought process, the way he taught his children, what he thought about when he got married, started having children, what he wanted to do and how he wanted to guide his children. They read the Bible. They read constantly. Both of them did. They were very big readers. So if you get a chance to go to the house in Menor, you will see the library filled with their books. And of course, there is a large portion that are theology-based books, not just Disciples of Christ, because they were learners, so they wanted to learn about everything. But
I think that's an interesting facet of the Puritan experience too, Jay, because when we think about pastimes for these folks who lived in the American colonies, for the Puritans, they lived a more reflective type of life, Jenny. Their pastimes were things that could be done in reflection. And reading was a major one. Another one, which would have gone along with that, would have been writing. And, or the lyceums, that they would have. And, the discourse that they would have within the communities. Whereas when I think about the Virginia Cavaliers, for instance, who came from the south and west of England, for instance, horse racing was a major ordeal, Ulysses. And thinking about the Celts in the South, with the cockfighting and the horse racing and that kind of thing. So theirs was more, Jay, in reflection, whereas the Puritans, or theirs was more, living for the sensation for the moment, whereas the Puritans, it was more of a reflective experience. Yeah. Ulysses, I know we've talked at great length about this over the last couple of years. Ulysses has been so kind because he's volunteered his time to visit with some of my students in Illinois about some of these subjects. And if you could opine a little bit on the Grant family, on the Root family, on the Dent family. Yeah.
So I've been scrabbling as you've been talking to try to figure out what you want me to say. And I realized that, but I'm thinking, so Ulysses S. Grant, that seems like to fall outside of that. And I realized there's also a generational shift that happens in my family. Because by the end of the 19th century, the second generation after Ulysses and Julia, my family, and my Dietz family, who were Alsatian Lutherans who migrate in the 1770s to New York, they're all Episcopalians by the end of the 19th century because they're in big cities and they're following the social trend that Episcopalianism is sort of the fashionable. But Ulysses' parents are Jesse and Hannah, and you couldn't get two more biblical names there. And Hannah is indeed, they're Methodists, but she is very much a Calvinist. And her whole life, as I said last night in this talk at Whitehaven, and I will say again on Saturday, so I can't give away all my lines, but she never went to the White House because that was prideful, that she never acknowledged physically that her son was the president because that would be bold, that would be a prideful thing. Whereas her husband, Jesse, was a lot less Calvinist than she was, and he was rather more like Julia's father, who was a Southerner, but full of himself and rather boastful, so the two of them would lock horns over the dinner table at the White House. So I don't want to give away all the good stuff, but I'm interested in that but Ulysses' original name is Hiram. He's given a biblical name. There's some lore that they picked the names out of a hat. Hannah wanted a biblical name, and he got Hiram. And since she was mom, it was his first name. Her husband wanted a classical name, because that was the other great source of inspiration for people's intellectual lives in the 1820s when he was born, was the Greek writers. And so that's how the Ulysses got pulled out of the hat. But he was Ulysses, that was his middle name. And that got switched by him when he was a teenager because he hated his initials. And they never called him Hiram, they always called him Ulysses. So automatically, his parents, without knowing it, are sort of beginning to weaken that tradition of the name. Because there certainly were not, I'm just trying to think of what names came after that, because his own children were Fred and Nellie and Ulysses Jr. and Jesse. So they did get a Jesse in there, who was the least puritanical of all of the children. So, but I think but that sort of puritanical, and the other side of it, see, I don't know the history of the Grants and the Connecticut Grants, the Puritan Grants that come over in the 17th century. I mean, the only name I can think of off the top of my head is Matthew. And I think that may be the connection where a Matthew Grant marries into Ulysses' direct descent from Richard Warren, who was one of the Mayflower passengers, but who was from London. But he was a London businessman, and I don't know how he fit into that. He signed the Mayflower Compact, but he also, all of his children survived. He went back, brought his family, had more children. So he had 5 children, all of whom lived, all of whom had children. So there are something like 4 million descendants of Richard Warren today. And so my cousins include these Puritan people like Taylor Swift and Matt Damon, Bob Dole, Sarah Palin. I'm trying to think, there's another good one in there. So Richard Gere. And they never write. I don't know. But it's such. But what you said about all these people, that the Mayflower crowd, and there's a reason we know about them, and I'll get to that in a second, because Ulysses, in his own memoir, says, "My family has been American from the very beginning." He had no clue what his roots were, really. But his children, who got kicked around for being Westerners, being on the western edge of society, and then moving east where they were living in the midst of those people, which is where I grew up. I think we don't know exactly who did this, but I think it was his son Fred who dug in and found the Mayflower connection, because Ulysses went to his grave not knowing that. Julia was never aware of that I know. So I have a feeling that was sort of an unpuritanical thing to do, was to look up your heritage, because there's a little pride in that. So that sounds more like the next generation. But Ulysses himself has that characteristic of stoicism And this is one of the things that a lot of the mean stuff that was said about him in the course of his life, it didn't stick because his personality was very clear. And he wasn't a prig, but he never swore. When they went to Pompeii, he wouldn't go into one of the excavated houses because it had been a brothel under Roman times, and he wouldn't go in, although he did go to one somewhere in medieval Europe, but I guess he got carried away in his travels, but you'll have to talk to Louis Bacone about that.
Okay.
But he also, and there's a lot of his character sort of speaks to that, whereas Julia was a very different kind of a personality, although she was a Methodist. She was a Southern Methodist, a Missouri Methodist, a pro-slavery Methodist, and the Grants were much more Calvinistic. And I don't know how that, Methodism comes in the 18th century, right? Isn't that when?
Right.
So things have already begun to evolve by the time they get here. And of course, Jesse Grant leaves the East and moves west early in his life. So they're already, they're moving out of the sphere of the Puritan world. And Jesse throws off I never thought about his name being so puritanical, because he is such a modern man of the 1820s. And Hannah retains this sort of New England Puritan housewife ideal all through her life. And I wish we knew more about their marriage, but certainly she gives her son something very different from what Fred Dent gives her. And I'm assuming, I don't know who the Dents are, except they were from Maryland originally.
Okay.
So you can answer that question, but I don't see any of that in me except I like to read and write. And U.S.
Okay.
Grant read all the time, and he read aloud to Julia all the time.
Here's something to think about, though, Ulysses, because I've thought about this with all three of you and knowing your backgrounds. Your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, community service was always integral to their existences. And Ulysses, you've shared some, and I think about this coming from the civil religion in Puritan New England. It was obligatory for people to take part in the community. It was obligatory for people to take offices, whether it was the town treasurer, the town clerk, or the fence viewer, whatever it was. And something that Ulysses has spoken with me in the past in-depthly on has been that connection, that Puritan New England connection, when he thinks about his own parents' duties to better their communities. And so, Ulysses, if you could tell us a little bit about your parents' involvement living in Syracuse and just, how that relates to the Puritan experience.
I can't think of anything that would have rattled my mother and father more over their martinis to have me tell them that they were living a Puritan life. But, but they were, I guess that makes sense. Certainly, and I don't think of it that way. I think of it more as my mother coming from a military background, because my grandfather was a general, and the sense of duty. And Julia talks about that in her memoirs, that Ulysses had absolutely no sense of how to govern his children and would pretty much let them do anything they wanted to do, as long as it didn't interfere with duty. And I think that was certainly the way my mother was raised. And my mother had two sisters. There were no boys in their family. And that sense of civic duty, but that, to me, that may be a Puritan strain that's coming through the military. And my grandfather went to West Point because at 3 years old, his dying grandfather wrote to the president and said, "You have to get my baby Ulysses into West Point." So his career was decided for him. But that sense of public duty and being involved publicly was very deeply ingrained to both of my parents. And my mother, being a woman of her generation, did not work, except she worked all the time. So she did all of that stuff. And you move to a small city right after World War II, and you get yourself involved in whatever you do, and that involves civic engagement in whatever women did in that time. So I see that. I don't know if she was conscious of it that way, but I think that definitely runs through that. And I've never thought of my father's family as being like that at all. They were German Lutherans in New York until they became Episcopalians, and But they were New Yorkers, and there's nothing puritanical about them. The Germans and the Dutch and the English all mixing together in Manhattan in the
Right.
18th and 19th century.
Right.
So it's a whole, but you're right, it's a very different dynamic.
Yes.
And seems to me that history, well, there's a lot of civic engagement in New York City, but I don't know enough about it. I didn't grow up there. So, but yeah, I totally see that, and I had never thought about it in that light. And I don't know, I think of my grandfather Grant, who was U.S. Grant III, if he would have liked being called a Puritan either. Although maybe
not.
he was,
Yeah.
but because I hadn't even thought about that. I think in his head it had shifted, and he, as you mentioned, the Root. So my grandfather marries Edith Root, who is the daughter of Teddy Roosevelt, Secretary of State, and McKinley's Secretary of War, Elihu Root, which is a Puritan family going back. Elihu is a good biblical name, going back
Nobel
to.
Peace Prize winner,
Well,
too.
yeah, but that not in the 18th century, not in the 17th century.
No,
but-
right.
Yes, and he won a Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
Although if we get into the analysis of why he won that, it gets complicated. But anyway, that's a different kind of lecture. But they're very much that sense. But he is raised in a New England style college in New York State, because they've migrated from Farmington, Connecticut in the late 18th century, and his family are all they're mathematics professors at Hamilton College. They're very scholarly. They're very sort of sober and somber, and Elihu himself was, but he went to the big city. A lot of my ancestors were in New York City all at the same time, from different sources, all at the end of the 19th century. And he got into politics, which I guess is civic duty, public service at its best.
We hope.
But he took that all very seriously, and I think that's why my grandmother and grandfather got along so well. But again, I don't think they thought of it that way. They just got along. But they were also very reflective, though. My grandmother was, they talk about in her wedding announcement in the New York Times in 1907 that she got a lot of books, which I think puzzled the reporter who was writing the wedding report, that Miss Root or Mrs. Grant got a lot of books as wedding gifts, and they were both inveterate readers and writers and thoughtful people, and I hadn't thought about that. Since you've traced that back to Puritan ancestry, it's very different from my Alsatian Dietzes.
Well, another thing, and if we could shift gears, Ulysses, and I want to ask Jay Garfield about this. When we were talking about some of the Puritans' favorite ways of expressing themselves in their leisurely pursuits, sports was another one. And it was the idea, for instance, of doing things that were productive. For the Puritans, there always had to be a reason for everything. They had to be doing things, folks, so that there was a purpose to it. And that included the interaction they had with others in their sports. The Puritans it was kind of an early version of football. Some stories that were written about them kicking a football, kind of like what a football was, all over Boston one day, from the north end all the way down to Southie and back. But always with a purpose. In other words, or rowing. Think about the rowing teams at the schools out east, Ulysses. That would be another one, always being purpose. Well, Jay Garfield told me something really interesting about President Garfield the other day. Because in thinking about having a purpose for a particular pastime, Jay, this made me think about one of President Garfield's favorite pastimes, and that was baseball.
He wrote, he was an avid diarist, so we know a lot about, what he was thinking. And to take breaks while he was in Congress, there'd be baseball games being played, and he would go out and watch baseball. And he really enjoyed it. He really liked the game. And I actually, in an interview recently, I was asked if I had the opportunity to talk to James Garfield, what would I talk to him about? And I did, and I said flat out to him, I would talk to him about baseball. I played baseball in high school, college, so did my brother, and we were both athletes. He was an athlete. He liked to do He played croquet on the lawn, talks about that a lot. He had, at the house in Menor, he has exercise juggling pins, and he just did, he was active. He was an active person. The boys were active. Even Lucretia and Molly were active. So, you know, it was a big thing for him to do that, and he did express how much he loved baseball. And I know how much you love baseball too, so.
This is my baseball guy right here. Jenny, what about Calvin and Grace? What were, in addition to reading and writing, what may have been some of their favorite pastimes?
We'll start with Calvin. It would definitely be fly fishing. He loved to spend time fly fishing, and on the times that he was away from the office, back up in Plymouth. If he wanted to get a good workout, there was a mechanical horse in the White House. So he would ride that mechanical horse, and
See, there was a purpose to that.
there was.
Yeah.
And let's see, in terms of Grace, she just enjoyed hiking with friends of hers. Now you have to keep in mind that Grace lived 25 years after Calvin passed. Calvin had a heart attack when he was 60, and Grace lived another, into her 80s, like 79. So walking, hiking, she played the piano, she loved to sing, and we'll stick baseball in there too. She did not play baseball, but she absolutely loved baseball. She was the first woman of baseball, and she had a season pass for the American League, I believe it was.
Oh, sure, with the Senators.
With the Senators,
Yeah.
yep. Of course, her favorite team was actually the Boston Red Sox, but
Okay.
it would depend
Yeah,
on
sure.
where she was.
Right. Folks, I hate to do this because we only have about 5 minutes left, but if any of you have any questions for our wonderful 3 guests, please feel free to raise your hands, stand up, and we'd be happy to call on you and answer any questions you might have. Okay.
Just a
Hi,
sec.
Becky. Good to see you.
I just wanted to say that my mother, as a little girl in Washington D.C., because my grandfather worked with Calvin and Grace Coolidge to build the 3rd floor on the White House. He was in charge of the White House at that point as the Commissioner of Public Buildings, and my mother was obsessed with Grace Coolidge as a little girl. And I never got her to explain to me why, but I've always thought of that portrait of her in the red dress with the white dog, and that's the image I have in my head.
Jay Garfield, any closing comments?
You guys said it all.
And Jenny, anything else you'd like to add?
Not that I can really think. The
Okay.
Coolidges had a very simple lives in a simple place, in a simple small town, and it's just amazing that, a little boy who was a farmer grew up to be 30th President of the United States. And, if he was able to do it, anybody can do it. Yes, sir.
The one thing I heard about Calvin Coolidge, they always called him Silent Cal. Do you know anything about that?
The gentleman asked the question, how did Calvin Coolidge acquire that nickname of Silent Cal?
The short answer to that is because he didn't like small talk. He was shy. He was very shy. As a boy, he would climb under the kitchen table when people would come to the house because he was afraid. He didn't want to talk to them. But it's just not true that he was really silent. He was the great refrainer. He would not say things.
I love that,
that
the great
He's
refrain.
not going to say something that he doesn't feel like he needs to say. And I actually, to be totally honest, didn't see that for a long time because I'm a do girl, to, get things done girl.
Industrious, Puritan. Yeah.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. But, I'm starting to see he spoke with the press more than 500 times during his administration, which was more than any other president before him. So he was the people's man. And so I'm trying to get rid of the silent cow remark.
That's,
And you can help me.
it's not true. Listen to her.
Yeah, it's
But
not
U.S. Grant was notorious. People thought he was stupid because he didn't talk. And in fact, he didn't talk because he thought people were stupid and he didn't want to, he didn't want to make small talk.
Right.
But he was great in small groups.
Why waste my time?
But if you read Julia's memoirs, the banter that went on within the family was very different from his public reputation of being the Sphinx. That's what he was called. So I hadn't thought about those two things.
Just wanted to point out too, Jenny, I find it interesting when you were describing your great-grandparents' home, not being anything flashy.
Oh, no. not
Okay,
at all.
you know what? That sounds like Puritanism.
That's true.
Yeah.
It's very,
Yeah.
plain. They are actually making summer renovations this summer. I think it's to make it a little bit more accessible for people to get through it. And then the other thing I'll just mention is my grandmother. She wouldn't always agree. This would be Florence Coolidge, John Coolidge's wife. And she thought that the Coolidge Foundation was just going to go defunct after she and her husband, died off. And I said, well, what makes you think that? That's not true. We're going to keep it going. And she says, oh, who's going to do that? But anyway, I think part of it was a sense of pride in her thinking that something can't go on if she's not looking after it or if Grandpa's not. But I don't know.
I just wanted,
And here you are.
Here we are.
well,
It's huge.
I just wanted to thank all of you, and I appreciate all the time that you've afforded me over the years. And I hope I haven't been a pest.
Of course you have, Tim.
Folks, thank you so much. Please stay, if you're watching on YouTube, please stay tuned for our next program, the panel of so many of television and Hollywood's yesteryear celebrities. Thank you so much for coming out. I hope you enjoyed the program.
Is that